Hi, I'm Rachel, and this is my Author's Answer video for June 2026. The Author's Answer series was started by J.D. Archer and his writing group. I think for a couple of years they asked themselves weekly Q&As pertaining to their reading and writing habits. And then JD took several of those questions and brought them to his AuthorTube page and answered them there. So I'll link to all that information down below, JD's AuthorTube page, the blog with all of the Q&As for Author's Answer, and also my own AuthorTube playlist, because I have been asking and answering myself these questions in sequence for the past several years. Because I think there is something like 150 to 200 questions, so we still got a whiles to go, and I've been doing this for a while. This month I am up to question number 111. And that question is, how would you feel if you killed off a main character, and would you do it? And I feel like this is indicative of the fact that JD and most of his group were fantasy writers. Fantasy is a surprisingly bloody genre, or maybe not so surprisingly, because I feel like a lot of it is taken from, Granddaddy Tolkien. And Granddaddy Tolkien did the, massive good versus evil warfare that, scorched civilizations, as Sauron tried to take control of Middle-earth and all of that. And even as, the whole idea of evil lords kind of goes out of fashion, I still think a lot of epic fantasy is about creating epic history, and epic history is usually about the movement of empires or that sort of thing. So I don't know, I feel like that's a way that a lot of fantasy can be pretty violent or pretty deadly. But even when it comes to urban fantasy, sometimes I guess it could be like the kingdom of the vampires versus the kingdom of the werewolves, that sort of thing. But even if it's just, packs of roving vampires and werewolves just, hanging out, they're still deadly. In essence, that's what they do to survive. So I don't know. I'm saying that I think that that's why fantasy is so deadly, except there might be a little bit of pushback with this whole subgenre of cozy fantasy. Maybe I should try reading some of those, but my own fantasy project more or less fits in with the epic fantasy subgenre, and I definitely am trying to deal with creating societies and having clashes go on between different people, although my first book is a little less global in that way, and the conflicts are slightly less deadly, although I have killed off a couple of characters. I actually just came back from revising a chapter where I'm going to kill off a character in that chapter. Not my main characters, although I do feel like, I don't know, if I came up with an idea in the future where it made sense to kill a main character, I would do it. I think in this project I would ultimately kill my antagonist, and I think it would track thematically, and also with the fact that he is going to be putting himself into a lot of danger as it is. So, but I don't know if I'd kill off main characters. I don't intend to with this story, at least with my, protagonist. But I don't know how I'd feel. I guess I'm a little anxious that I wouldn't feel enough, and maybe that means I'm not invested enough in my own characters. So far I've killed off a couple of characters in the draft of my fantasy novel, and I'm not personally, too upset about it, although I'm trying to accurately depict how it impacts my character. And, part of that is the reason I kill off the characters, is how it impacts her and the larger story. But also, I try to, stay focused on hoping it's realistic. The whole idea is like, maybe with killing characters, the question is, are you doing it too much or too little? If you've created a world that has a lot of violence going on, but nobody important gets hurt, that, is questionable. But also, just killing people off willy-nilly is not, actually, it doesn't always serve the story. So anyway, I think I'm going to link down below to a podcast that talks about all of this in a lot more detail than I am so far, Mythcreants, which is a sci-fi fantasy leaning podcast, talked about the subject of killing off main characters a couple of years ago. And they really dove deep into, the idea of making sure that, it serves the story and that it's believable to the stakes of the story, whether or not you do it. And of course, how it serves, the characters themselves and how they'll react to it. I think they talk about that a little bit as well. I think the major story that makes us think of killing main characters is Game of Thrones, the first book of Game of Thrones, which was then turned into the first season of the television show, where Ned Stark was definitely the main character, and he definitely died at the end of that story. I mean, granted, the broader, epic warfare and shifting tides of Westeros and Essos is larger than the one book. But in that one book, Ned was the main character and he died at the end. And I think that it made a lot of sense for that story, given who he was as a character, like his stubbornness about his honor, and that he was, putting himself into situations with people who had more power than him and didn't share those beliefs. And so that's really what, in large part, led to his downfall. And of course, that set up expectations for the readers that war is coming and you can't expect for the traditional survivors to be safe. I do kind of think, and the Mythcreants podcast went into how killing off a lot of characters in later books was more problematic, in part because in some of the later books, a lot of the characters that were killed off were sort of the plot drivers of the overall story. And so in large part, we're left with like the Stark children and Daenerys, like at separate corners of, the continents, and they're just not connected to each other yet. And they're like in much more smaller arcs to themselves. And I think Martin is having a lot of trouble trying to figure out how to untangle and get, the broader plot moving again. He's introduced a lot of new characters as POVs in the later books, but, the audience in general doesn't have the emotional attachment to those people. So there is that. I'll also admit, I don't usually do this, but I'll admit to watching The Boys adaptation on Amazon Prime, which was an adaptation of a comic book series, which was satirical about comic book tropes. And then this television show in general also became very satirical about US especially, and to a lesser extent world politics. And this was the last season, and it was a bit strange, and I feel like it, ironically, for a series that I think really cut its teeth on mocking some of the downfalls of superhero genres, it kind of fell into them in this last season, where there was a lot of, just taking a lot of time to set up sequels or prequels and fan servicey stuff. I mean, this is a show that is very gory and very violent, and so everybody's expecting some scorched earth ending. Well, actually, that's actually the literal phrase that the protagonist and antagonist use about each other and their, sort of end of days, battle that they'll do against each other. And so we're expecting a lot of characters to die. And when it comes to the main characters, actually, it was surprisingly tame and a little bit gentle with the one character, main character, who did die in a way that isn't true in most other cases in the story. And then coming back to the idea of killing main characters, both of these main characters, the protagonist and the antagonist, died at the end of The Boys. And I think for the it's not actually always clear to tell who's who, but for one of those characters, I think it kind of made sense how he died. In terms of what was driving him and the people who were in place to try to stop him, and that he also wasn't powerful enough to, get away with it, which is the problem with the other character who died, in that the show made him way too powerful, and that the fact that he died, a lot of the fandom really questioned that if it would be possible. So I feel like that's a major flaw in a lot of superhero franchises, that some of their characters are just way too strong to face any consequences, and it could hurt the story overall, unless perhaps you want a nihilistic ending where everything burns. In fact, I did just see a fan edit of The Boys where the season actually ends with this, I guess he's the antagonist, instead of he dying, he just goes ahead and like basically burns the earth down. And it's very disquieting, although it may be the most disquieting thing is how much of this was accomplished with a random person using AI. So that's a whole other ball game. So maybe I'll link to that down below as well in case you're familiar with The Boys. It is a very violent, gory show, so, you know, content warnings. So yeah, I guess to bring it back and just reiterate the main point before I went rambling off myself, the idea of killing main characters, it has to, you know, serve two purposes, I think. First, it has to fit the scope of the overall story, that it makes sense that the person could die. And secondly, that it would have some sort of impact on the interior story that you're telling as well, about what the main characters are trying to personally accomplish and what that death would or would not bring to the themes and so forth that you're bringing to that. So yeah, I think that about covers it for me now. This was an interesting fantasy sort of question, I think, where I could go off the rails in some fun ways that hopefully made some sort of sense. I'll be back on this channel within the next couple of days with my next Am Reading video of the month, so stay tuned for that. And in the meantime, thanks so much for watching, everyone. Keep writing, and I'll see you next time.